Midland Agriculture Incorporated legally owns the mineral rights beneath this farm, and we're exercising our option to begin extraction next month, declared Victoria Hargrove, tapping her manicured nails on the land survey map spread across Jackson Calloway's kitchen table. The fourth-generation farmer's weathered hands clenched into fists as company geologists already began marking test sites across his family's century-old wheat fields. But 6 weeks later, when state officials and tribal representatives gathered at the old stone barn, Hargrove's confident smile vanished as Professor Raymond Chen stepped forward. "We've confirmed that the Calloway Farm sits on historically significant indigenous lands, with documented ceremonial sites that were illegally transferred in 1897, making it immediately subject to the Native American Heritage Protection Act and exempt from all subsurface development." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Huxley County had once been known for its unbroken prairie and rich soil. For generations, farming families had worked the land, following the rhythms of planting and harvest that defined the heartland. The Calloway Farm, with its distinctive stone barn and sturdy farmhouse, had stood as a landmark for over a century, its boundaries marked by the same oak trees planted by Jackson's great-grandfather. In recent years, as agricultural corporations expanded and energy companies discovered resources beneath the prairie, many family farms had surrendered to economic pressures. Land once valued solely for crops suddenly became prized for natural gas deposits that promised wealth beyond what farming could provide. Jackson Calloway, 52, was the fourth generation to work this stretch of land. His great-grandfather, William, had established the farm in 1897, building the stone barn using limestone quarried from the property itself. Family stories told how William had insisted on the barn's unusual octagonal design, claiming he'd been inspired by a dream about the land's true purpose. The Calloway Farm, 320 acres of prime soil, had sustained the family through drought, depression, and the transformation of American agriculture. Despite growing pressure from industrial operations, Jackson maintained the family's sustainable farming practices, growing heritage wheat varieties sought after by artisanal bakeries across 3 states. Victoria Hargrove had arrived in Huxley County 9 months earlier as Regional Acquisition Director for Midland Agriculture. At 38, she had established a reputation for efficiently securing land and mineral rights throughout the Midwest. With her corporate background and East Coast education, she embodied the new face of agriculture, focused on extraction and profit, rather than stewardship and sustainability. Hargrove had established her office in the renovated county courthouse, historically the heart of the farming community. This symbolic takeover hadn't gone unnoticed by longtime residents, who watched with growing concern as family farms were consolidated into corporate holdings or leased for resource extraction. Jackson sat at his kitchen table on a warm spring evening, reviewing a certified letter from Midland Agriculture stating their research had uncovered a significant title discrepancy regarding mineral rights to his property. According to their legal team, when William Calloway purchased the land in 1897, the deed had explicitly excluded subsurface rights, which had been retained by the previous owner and eventually acquired by Midland. The letter stated that while his surface ownership wasn't questioned, Midland intended to exercise its rights to resources beneath his farm, with operations beginning in 30 days. The company was generously offering compensation for access and disruption, though the amount would barely cover a year's expenses. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, Jackson recognized Victoria Hargrove's luxury SUV in his gravel driveway. With reluctance, he opened the door, to find the corporate executive on his porch, dressed in what city people imagined as appropriate farm attire, expensive jeans that had never seen dirt, and a button-down shirt too crisp for honest work. "Mr. Calloway," she began with professional politeness that never reached her eyes. "I thought it might be helpful to discuss our notification in person." Jackson invited her inside, the generations of rural courtesy overriding his suspicions about the timing of this visit. They settled at the kitchen table, its oak surface worn smooth by 4 generations of Calloway hands. Hargrove's leather portfolio looked alien against the weathered wood. "Mr. Calloway, I'll be direct," Hargrove began. "Our title research has been thorough. The mineral rights to this property were never transferred to your great-grandfather when he purchased the land. This was common practice in that era, separating surface rights from subsurface rights. This farm has been in my family for over a century," Jackson replied firmly. "Nobody has ever questioned our ownership or claimed rights to what's beneath it. That's because the resources weren't economically viable until recent extraction technology," Hargrove explained with practiced patience. "The rights existed legally, but there was no reason to exercise them until now." "And you can just come onto my land and start drilling?" Jackson asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "We're not just telling you, we're offering compensation. Well above standard rates," Hargrove replied, sliding a document across the table. "Midland is prepared to pay $75,000 for access. That's significantly more generous than required by law." Jackson glanced at the figure, knowing it was a fraction of what the company would make from the resources beneath his land, and nowhere near enough to offset the impact on his farming operation. "I need time to review this with my lawyer," he said carefully. "Of course," Hargrove replied, "but I should mention that our geological survey team is scheduled to begin preliminary work next week. Also," she paused deliberately, "I've become aware that your application for organic certification might face new challenges if you delay too long. The approval committee includes several people with connections to regional development." Jackson stared hard at Hargrove. "Are you threatening to interfere with my certification process?" Hargrove smiled thinly. "Not at all. I'm simply noting that agricultural decisions in this region involve interconnected interests. Information and influence tend to flow where mutual benefit exists." The implication was clear. Hargrove had leverage beyond mineral rights and was prepared to use it. "In fact," she continued, "you might find the certification process suddenly simplified if we reach an amicable agreement about access. Midland has considerable influence with regulatory bodies throughout the region." "I'll need to think about this," Jackson said, containing his anger with effort. After Hargrove left, Jackson remained at the kitchen table, the compensation offer before him representing a fraction of his farm's true value and potentially the end of the sustainable practices he had worked so hard to establish. A veiled threat about the organic certification, crucial for the premium pricing his heritage wheat commanded, revealed how thoroughly Midland had researched his vulnerabilities. What Jackson couldn't know was that Hargrove's visit hadn't been merely informational. Earlier that day, she had met with county officials to accelerate approval for access roads and equipment staging areas on county land adjacent to his property, creating facts on the ground that would make resistance more difficult. What neither of them realized was that the distinctive stone barn contained historical significance that would dramatically alter the balance of power in their confrontation. Evidence hidden within its walls that no one had recognized in over a century. Though, morning after Hargrove's visit, Jackson rose before dawn, as farmers have done for generations. Instead of immediately tending to his morning chores, he found himself drawn to the old stone barn. Standing in its cool interior as early light filtered through dusty windows, he studied the structure with new eyes, not just as a familiar building he'd known his entire life, but as something that might soon be surrounded by drilling equipment and access roads. The Calloway barn had always been unusual compared to others in the county. Its octagonal design, the precisely cut limestone blocks, and the curious carved symbols on certain keystones had become so familiar to Jackson that he rarely noticed these distinctive features anymore. Now, with Midland's threat hanging over him, these details seemed like clues to something he had never fully understood. Dad always said great-grandpa William was particular about how this place was built, Jackson murmured to himself, running a hand along one of the smooth stone arches. William had established the farm after returning from studying architecture back east, insisting on construction methods that incorporated both modern engineering and traditional techniques that were already becoming rare at that time. As Jackson moved feed for his livestock, his mind kept returning to his great-grandfather's unusual design choices. Why had he insisted on the octagonal shape when a rectangular barn would have been simpler to construct? Why position it at this precise angle on the property? Why incorporate the strange symbols that locals had always assumed were merely decorative? Later that morning, Jackson called the one person who might shed light on his situation. Dr. Elena Martinez had been a history professor at the State University and regional archaeological consultant for nearly 20 years. At 58, she had dedicated her career to documenting the often overlooked history of the prairie states, with particular focus on the intersection of European settlement and indigenous cultures. Mineral rights challenges, eh? Elena said when Jackson explained the situation. I've seen this happening all across the region. These corporations have teams of researchers digging through century-old records looking for legal loopholes. She's offering enough to clear my immediate debts, Jackson admitted. But once I allow drilling, the land will never be the same. 4 generations ended with me. The timing is suspicious, Elena noted. Have you looked into whether there might be a legal challenge to their claim on the mineral rights? Wouldn't know where to start, Jackson replied. But Hargrove seemed to know all about my organic certification application before I mentioned it. Elena was silent for a moment. Bring me copies of whatever documentation you have about the original purchase, and Jackson, check your family records. Your great-grandfather kept detailed journals about the farm's establishment. There might be something about the property's history that could help. That afternoon, Jackson climbed into the farmhouse attic, where generations of family documents were stored in old trunks and wooden crates. It took hours of searching through dusty papers before he found a leather-bound journal with William H. Calloway, 1895-1902, embossed on the spine. The journal chronicled his great-grandfather's purchase of the land and the construction of the farm buildings in meticulous detail. Most entries focused on practical matters, materials acquisition, construction progress, crop planning, but scattered throughout were cryptic references that caught Jackson's attention. Met with Chief R, again regarding the true boundaries. His people's knowledge must be respected if this enterprise is to succeed. The tribal elders have shown me the markers. I will incorporate them exactly as instructed, though the county recorder need not know the full purpose. The central chamber. Foundation is complete. Additional cost considerable, but there can be no compromise on this aspect. Jackson frowned at the word chamber. His barn had no chamber that he knew of, just the main floor, hayloft, and small storage areas. He continued reading, finding more puzzling entries. The artifacts arrived today from the tribal repository. The responsibility weighs heavily, but I cannot refuse what history has placed in my hands. Completed the hidden access today, while the other workers were at lunch. Only Chief R knows its location. Better that way. The journal entries became increasingly cryptic about the barn's purpose. The county officials suspect nothing. They see only a farmer's barn, not understanding that its dimensions and positioning align precisely with the ancient gathering place. The stones remember what papers forget. The journal ended abruptly in 1902 with a final entry. All is secure. The sacred items rest where they belong, hidden from those who would misunderstand their significance. I have honored my promise to the elders, and in return they have blessed this land with prosperity that will sustain my descendants, if they remember to honor the earth that feeds them. Jackson sat back, dust motes dancing in the attic's dim light. His great-grandfather had apparently built some kind of hidden chamber within the barn, a chamber containing items of significance to the local indigenous people, deliberately concealed from county officials. The next morning, Jackson met Elena at the university, bringing both the mineral rights notification and his great-grandfather's journal. While Eleanor examined the Midland documents with growing concern, Jackson showed her the journal entries. "Your great-grandfather built a hidden room in that barn," Elena said, looking up from the journal with undisguised excitement. "And he did. It in consultation with indigenous leaders who apparently entrusted him with items of cultural significance. But where? I've been in every corner of that barn my entire life." Elena studied the journal more carefully. Chief R almost certainly refers to Chief Running Elk of the Prairie Lake people. They were the original inhabitants of this region before being displaced in the 1870s. She turned a page, her expression growing more animated. "Jackson, these symbols your great-grandfather mentions, do they look like this?" She turned her laptop toward him, showing images of carved stone markers with geometric patterns. "Yes, those exact patterns are carved into keystones throughout the barn. I always thought they were just decorative. They're boundary markers and directional symbols used by the Prairie Lake people," Elena explained. "They identified sacred sites and ceremonial grounds." She turned back to the journal, reading more intently. "According to these entries, your great-grandfather deliberately incorporated these symbols to honor the land's original purpose, while hiding their significance from county officials." She turned to the Midland documents. "As for these mineral rights claims, there's something strange here. If your great-grandfather was working closely with the tribal leaders, it's unlikely he would have recognized the seller's right to separate the surface from what lies beneath. That violates fundamental indigenous concepts of land. Could that help stop Midland's claim? Possibly, but proving it would take time we may not have," Elena said. "Our best hope might be finding whatever your great-grandfather hid in that barn. If it's historically significant enough, particularly if it relates to indigenous cultural heritage." She didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what she meant. Historical and cultural significance could potentially protect the property from development. That afternoon, they returned to the Calloway Farm with Dr. Raymond Chen, an archaeologist specializing in indigenous sites of the Great Plains. Armed with the journal, measuring equipment, and Dr. Chen's knowledge of Prairie Lake people symbolism, they began a systematic examination of the barn. "Your great-grandfather was honoring traditional knowledge while using his architectural training," Dr. Chen said, "studying the position of the carved symbols. These aren't just decorative. They're creating a specific pattern that maps to celestial alignments significant to the Prairie Lake culture. For hours, they measured distances between stone markers, examined floor sections, and tapped walls for hollow spaces. As the afternoon light began to fade, frustration was setting in. The journal mentions the hidden access, but gives no clear indication of its location, Jackson said. "We could miss it entirely, even if it's right in front of us." Elena sat on a hay bale, flipping through the journal again. "Wait, there's something here. He writes about the gateway revealing itself when the summer sun reaches its highest point on the day of longest light." "The summer solstice," Dr. Chen suggested immediately. Many indigenous structures incorporated solar alignments, particularly for the solstices. "But that's weeks away," Jackson said. "Midland's survey team is scheduled to start preliminary work in 5 days." Dr. Chen studied the barn's interior more carefully. The alignment wouldn't be exactly the same today as on the solstice, but it should be close enough to identify the general location. They repositioned themselves, studying how light entered through the high windows and where the beams fell on the stone floor. Dr. Chen made calculations based on the current solar position relative to the upcoming solstice. "If I'm right about the Prairie Lake traditions," he explained, "they would have created a system where light entering through a specific point would illuminate a marker on significant days, using string to trace the light paths and extending them." Based on Dr. Chen's calculations, they identified a spot on the eastern wall where all their projected lines converged. The wall appeared solid, weathered limestone blocks like the rest of the barn. "There's nothing here," Jackson said, running his hands over the cool stone surface. "Look at the mortar patterns," Dr. Chen suggested. "Sacred chambers often had entry mechanisms that followed symbolic patterns." Elena examined the keystones near the convergence point. "These symbols create a sequence. See how they progress from simple to complex? They might indicate an order." Following the sequence suggested by the symbols, Jackson pressed specific stones in order. After the fourth press, they heard a faint scraping sound, and a section of the wall, about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, shifted inward slightly. "It's a door," Jackson whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. Carefully, they pulled the disguised door open, revealing a narrow passage into darkness. Jackson retrieved flashlights from his truck, and they cautiously entered the hidden space. The secret chamber was circular, perhaps 12 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling and no windows. But what it contained made them all stop in astonishment. Stone shelves lined the walls, holding carved ceremonial objects, woven baskets, and what appeared to be ancient maps marked on leather. In the center stood a small stone altar, and on the floor surrounding it was an intricate mosaic depicting what appeared to be the regional watershed system, rivers, streams, and lakes represented in colored stones with remarkable accuracy. "This is a ceremonial chamber of the Prairie Lake people," Dr. Chen breathed, sweeping his flashlight across the pristine artifacts. "And these—" He carefully approached a section containing what appeared to be leather scrolls. "These might be their land records and treaty documents." Elena carefully examined one of the wall carvings. "This is extraordinary. Some of these artifacts were thought to have been destroyed during the forced relocations. This isn't just a storage space, it's a deliberately preserved cultural record." Jackson approached the center altar, where a sealed cedar box was prominently displayed, marked with symbols similar to those on the barn's keystones. With Dr. Chen's guidance, he carefully opened it to find a leather-bound document and what appeared to be a ceremonial pipe wrapped in protective cloth. The document, written in both English and the Prairie Lake language, was dated April 15th, 1896. This agreement between Chief Running Elk of the Prairie Lake people and William H. Calloway acknowledges that the land known to settlers as the east half of Section 12 contains the sacred council grounds of our ancestors. In exchange for William Calloway's promise to preserve the sacred site and protect the ceremonial objects entrusted to him, the Prairie Lake Council grants him the right to farm the surrounding lands with the understanding that the earth shall not be pierced nor the waters polluted. The true boundaries of the sacred council grounds are marked by the stone symbols incorporated into the structure built to protect them. William Calloway and his descendants are entrusted as guardians, not owners, of this sacred place. Should this trust be broken, rights to the land shall revert to the Prairie Lake people. This agreement supersedes all claims of previous holders of paper deeds, as they obtained such documents without the consent of those who have held these lands since time immemorial. The document bore the signatures of Chief Running Elk, William Calloway, and 7 tribal elders, along with the seal of a territorial judge who had apparently witnessed the agreement. Jackson lowered the document, meeting Elena's wide eyes. "This isn't just historically significant, she whispered. This is a legally executed agreement acknowledging indigenous rights to this land that predates the deed Midland is using to claim mineral rights, and it explicitly prohibits the type of drilling they're planning. Dr. Chen carefully examined one of the ceremonial objects. These artifacts represent one of the most important indigenous cultural discoveries in the region in decades. The chamber itself appears to be positioned directly above an original council site, which would make this location eligible for protection under the Native American Heritage Preservation Act. Jackson nodded, still processing the magnitude of what they had discovered hidden within the walls of his family's barn, a historical and cultural treasure his great-grandfather had constructed an entire building to conceal and protect. Hargrove wants to drill through this land for its resources, Jackson said quietly. She has no idea what's actually here, what's been preserved for generations. Elena's expression shifted from awe to determination. And now we have the documentation to ensure she never gets the chance. This discovery changes everything, Jackson. As they carefully resealed the hidden chamber, ensuring its contents remained undisturbed until proper preservation experts could be consulted, Jackson felt a profound connection to his great-grandfather and a new understanding of the legacy he had been entrusted to protect, a legacy far more significant than he had ever imagined. "We need to approach this carefully," Elena advised as they gathered at Jackson's kitchen table that evening. "What we've found isn't just historically interesting, it's a potential legal bombshell. That agreement between Chief Running Elk and your great-grandfather could invalidate Midland's entire claim to the mineral rights." Dr. Chen nodded, making notes on proper documentation protocols. "These artifacts have been protected in that chamber for over a century. Improper handling or exposure could cause irreparable damage. And culturally, we need to involve the Prairie Lake people's current leadership immediately." Jackson stared at the photocopy they'd made of the agreement, now carefully placed in a protective sleeve Elena had brought. "Who do we even contact about something like this? I don't want to just call Midland and tell them their mineral rights are invalid." "We need a multi-layered approach," Elena replied firmly. "This involves historical preservation, indigenous, cultural heritage, and legal land rights. We need to coordinate with the Prairie Lake Tribal Council, the State Historical Preservation Office, and probably get a specialized land rights attorney. Midland's survey team is scheduled to arrive in 4 days, Jackson reminded them. "I can refuse them access to my property, but they'll just get a court order based on their mineral rights claim." Elena tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the table. "Michael Running Bear at the Tribal Cultural Preservation Office should be our first call. As a direct descendant of Chief Running Elk and the tribe's legal counsel, he has standing to challenge Midland's claim immediately." Dr. Chen looked up from his notes. "I know Michael from several preservation projects. I can call him tonight, but he'll need some preliminary documentation before taking action." "What about county records?" Jackson asked. "Shouldn't we look for any official record of this agreement?" "Doubtful it was ever recorded officially," Elena explained. "In 1896, agreements with indigenous people were often deliberately kept out of county records by officials sympathetic to land speculators. But the territorial judge's seal makes it a legally executed document, regardless of whether it was recorded." They developed a 3-pronged strategy. Dr. Chen would contact Michael Running Bear and the Tribal Council. Elena would prepare documentation for the State Historical Preservation Office, and Jackson would consult with a land rights attorney recommended by Elena. "Don't tell anyone else about the chamber yet," Eleanor cautioned as they concluded their planning. "Midland has connections throughout the county, and the fewer people who know before we secure legal protection, the better." The following morning, Jackson was checking fence lines when he noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked on the county road near his property. Through binoculars, he could see someone with surveying equipment, apparently marking boundaries well in advance of the scheduled survey. The premature activity was concerning, but not surprising. Midland would naturally want to establish as many facts on the ground as possible. What Jackson didn't know was that at that very moment, Victoria Hargrove was meeting with county officials to expedite permits for access roads and preliminary drilling tests. The executive had brought detailed geological surveys showing significant natural gas deposits beneath the Calloway Farm. The Calloway property is the keystone of our entire regional extraction plan, Hargrove explained to county commissioners. Our subsurface mapping indicates a particularly rich deposit that could generate significant tax revenue for the county. And the current owner is cooperating? One commissioner asked. Hargrove smiled confidently. We've made a fair offer for access that I expect will be accepted shortly. Mr. Calloway understands the economic realities of modern agriculture. What Hargrove didn't share was that she had already scheduled drilling equipment to be delivered to a staging area just outside Jackson's property line the day after her deadline expired, creating a point-of-no-return pressure tactic that had worked effectively in previous negotiations. Meanwhile, Michael Running Bear arrived at the Calloway Farm that afternoon, having cleared his schedule after Dr. Chen's urgent call. At 45, he combined the formal legal training of a Harvard-educated attorney with deep knowledge of his people's traditional practices and land claims. I should caution you that we investigate many claims about agreements with our ancestors, he told Jackson as they walked toward the barn. Most turn out to be either misunderstandings or deliberate fabrications, Jackson nodded. I understand. I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. He led Michael and Eleanor to the hidden chamber, carefully demonstrating the mechanism that revealed the concealed door. As the tribal attorney stepped into the secret room, his professional reserve visibly faltered. The council chamber, he whispered, his voice filled with recognition as he surveyed the pristine artifacts. For the next 2 hours, Michael examined the chamber's contents, handling each item with reverence while documenting everything with photographs. He studied the agreement between Chief Running Elk and William Calloway multiple times, occasionally murmuring to himself in his native language. My great-grandfather spoke of this place in our family stories, he explained, carefully, examining the mosaic map on the floor. According to our oral history, when the government forced most of our people onto reservations, a small group of elders made an arrangement with a sympathetic settler to preserve our most sacred items and protect our council grounds. The location was kept secret, passed down only through the hereditary chiefs. Over generations, as our people were scattered, the exact location was lost, though we never stopped searching. He carefully examined the ceremonial pipe from the cedar box. This is the peace pipe of 7 councils, thought lost during the relocations. Its existence is documented in tribal records, but it hasn't been seen in over a century. Jackson watched him catalogue the discovery, his expression growing increasingly solemn. Can this help stop Midland from drilling? Michael nodded emphatically. This isn't merely significant, Mr. Calloway. It's potentially a landmark case for indigenous land rights. This agreement explicitly prohibits subsurface disturbance and was executed with the witness of a territorial judge, giving it legal standing even by the standards of that time. How quickly can you take action? Elena asked. I'll file an emergency injunction today. It should be issued within 48 hours, Michael replied. Additionally, I'll initiate the process for having this site designated as a protected cultural heritage site under the Native American Heritage Protection Act. How long would the injunction protect the property? Jackson asked. Initially 30 days. That would give us time to assemble our full legal case and pursue permanent protection, Michael explained. Given what I've seen, I'm confident we can establish that this site is protected under multiple federal laws that would supersede any mineral rights claims. As they carefully resealed the hidden chamber, Michael's phone rang. His expression darkened as he listened to the caller. "It seems word of a significant indigenous discovery at the Calloway Farm has already reached the county offices," he said, after ending the call. "Someone there contacted our tribal office asking for information." Jackson and Eleanor exchanged concerned looks. Their window of secrecy was closing faster than anticipated. Hargrove must have informants throughout the local government. Elena surmised. If she learns what's here before the injunction is issued, she didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the risk. Hargrove might accelerate Midland's timeline or find ways to challenge the discovery before protections could be put in place. Michael departed to file the emergency injunction, promising to expedite the process as much as possible. As his car disappeared down the gravel drive, Jackson noticed the surveying vehicle had moved closer to his property line, now openly taking measurements of his access road. That evening, Elena arrived with troubling news. "I spoke with my contact at the county recorder's office about searching for any record related to your great-grandfather's purchase. She found something strange. All land records for this township from 1890 to 1900 have been temporarily removed for digitization as of yesterday morning." "What does that mean?" "It means someone at the county is deliberately restricting access to the historical records that might support your case," Elena explained. "They're covering all bases. Hargrove likely knows we're investigating the property's history." Jackson's phone rang, an unknown number. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Calloway, this is Thomas Wilson from the county zoning department," a brusque voice announced. "I'm calling to inform you that we've received an application for reclassification of your property from agricultural to resource extraction zone. As the surface rights owner, you have 3 days to file any objections before the preliminary approval." The timeline had been accelerated significantly. After Jackson relayed this development to Eleanor, they called Dr. Chen, who had been researching preservation options. "They're moving faster than expected," Dr. Chen said when told about the rezoning application. "Hargrove must suspect we've found something significant and is pushing to create as many administrative hurdles as possible." "Can they legally rezone my property without my consent?" Jackson asked. "Normally no, but they can cite critical resource development as justification," Dr. Chen explained. "It's questionable, but challenging. It would take longer than the 3 days we now have." The pressure campaign intensified the following morning when Jackson received a revised letter from Midland, this one indicating that their survey team would arrive tomorrow rather than in 4 days, accompanied by county officials, to ensure access in accordance with mineral rights laws. "They're accelerating everything," Elena observed. "Hargrove is clearly worried about whatever we might have discovered." Their fears were confirmed when county vehicles appeared at the farm entrance that afternoon. 2 officials emerged, explaining they needed to conduct an environmental assessment prior to the survey team's arrival. "This property has been farmland for over a century," Jackson protested as he accompanied them on their inspection. "We're just following procedure, Mr. Calloway," the lead official replied, though his uncomfortable expression suggested he understood the timing was suspicious. Jackson carefully steered them away from the barn, watching anxiously as they took soil samples and photographs. To his relief, they showed no particular interest in the stone building, focusing instead on the areas Midland had marked for potential drill sites. As the officials departed, Jackson spotted Victoria Hargrove's Tesla turning into his driveway. The executive had decided to make a personal appearance, likely hoping to capitalize on the mounting pressure. "Jackson," she called with forced friendliness as she approached. "I thought we should talk, given the accelerated timeline. Our geological team is eager to begin their assessment." "You moved up the survey without consulting me," Jackson replied coldly. And somehow the county is already processing a zoning change. Hargrove's smile remained fixed. Resource development timelines are always fluid. As for the zoning, that's standard procedure for properties with confirmed mineral deposits. Her gaze shifted toward the stone barn. I understand you've had some visitors lately. Historians and tribal representatives, I'm told, found something interesting in that old barn. The direct acknowledgement confirmed their suspicions. Hargrove had informants monitoring the property and was well aware something significant had been discovered. Just researching the farm's history, Jackson replied neutrally. My great-grandfather's construction techniques have drawn some academic interest. Historical features rarely affect resource development significantly, Hargrove said dismissively. At most, they might require some minor accommodations or documentation before proceeding. Our revised timeline takes any such minor delays into account. I haven't agreed to your access proposal, Jackson reminded her. Hargrove's expression hardened. The mineral rights are legally separate from your surface ownership, Mr. Calloway. While we prefer cooperative arrangements, we can and will secure legal access if necessary. Our survey team will arrive tomorrow with the appropriate court orders. The threat hung in the air between them. Hargrove clearly believed she still held all the leverage, unaware that Michael Running Bear was already filing for an emergency injunction based on the Chamber's discovery. I appreciate your directness, Jackson replied with careful restraint, but I'll need to consult with my attorney before allowing anyone access to my property. As Hargrove departed, her normally confident demeanor showed subtle signs of frustration. The executive had clearly expected Jackson to capitulate under the intensified pressure, and his continued resistance suggested something had changed in the equation. What Hargrove couldn't know was that Michael Running Bear had already submitted his emergency filing with preliminary photographs of the hidden chamber's contents, photographs that had caused immediate excitement among both tribal leaders and federal officials responsible for indigenous cultural preservation. The race was now on, Hargrove accelerating Midland's timeline while Jackson and his allies worked to secure protection for the historical and cultural treasure hidden within the walls of the Calloway barn. Less than 24 hours remained before Midland's survey team would arrive, but the next 12 hours would likely determine whether a century-old agreement would be honored or if corporate interests would prevail. As dusk settled over the farm, Jackson stood alone by the stone barn, placing his hand on the cool limestone his great-grandfather had carefully assembled to protect something far more precious than anyone had realized. Tomorrow would bring either the first step toward permanent protection of this sacred site or the beginning of a more difficult legal battle against a powerful corporation with seemingly unlimited resources. What Jackson didn't yet know was that Elena and Dr. Chen had made one more critical discovery while researching William Calloway's background, information that would further strengthen their case, but also escalate the conflict with Midland to an entirely new level. The next morning brought unexpected activity to the Calloway Farm. A tribal van emblazoned with the Prairie Lake Nation seal arrived first, followed by two vehicles with federal government plates. Michael Running Bear emerged from the lead car, accompanied by a distinguished woman in professional attire who carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Mr. Calloway," Michael called as Jackson approached. "This is Dr. Diana Blackhawk from the Department of Interior's Office of Tribal Relations. After reviewing my preliminary filing, she flew in overnight from Washington." Jackson shook hands with the federal official, who studied him with keen interest. "William Calloway was your great-grandfather, correct? His name appears in several federal archives as a notable advocate for fair treatment of indigenous peoples, during a time when such positions were deeply unpopular." "I never knew that part of his history," Jackson admitted. "The family just described him as a principled man who built this farm from nothing." Dr. Blackhawk nodded. Many such alliances were kept quiet for the protection of both parties. The political climate of the 1890s made public advocacy dangerous, particularly in frontier regions where land speculators wielded considerable influence. A second federal vehicle disgorged two more officials who were introduced as representatives from the National Historic Preservation Service. Their presence underscored the seriousness with which the federal government was treating the discovery. As the group walked toward the barn, Jackson noticed a county sheriff's vehicle parked at his property entrance. Deputy Garcia approached, looking uncomfortable with his assignment. "Mr. Calloway, I've been instructed to deliver this," he said, handing him an envelope bearing the Midland Agriculture logo. "It's a formal notice that their survey team will arrive at noon today under the protection of a court order signed by Judge Wilson this morning. I'm required to inform you that obstruction could result in contempt charges." The timing was deliberate. Midland had secured their court order at the earliest possible moment, likely hoping to establish access before any competing legal claim could be filed. Michael took immediate notice of the exchange. "The emergency injunction should be signed by Judge Redstone within hours," he assured Jackson. "Once issued, it would supersede any access order based solely on mineral rights claims." "But if Midland's team arrives first?" Jackson asked. Dr. Blackhawk stepped in. "Given the potential significance under the Native American Heritage Protection Act, we have options for immediate intervention. I've already alerted the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding potential federal jurisdiction, if necessary." The assembled experts proceeded to the barn, where Jackson revealed the hidden chamber. The federal officials entered with careful reverence, their initial professional reserve giving way to evident excitement as they examined the pristine cultural repository. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Blackhawk breathed, carefully examining the floor mosaic without touching it. "This appears to be a complete ceremonial mapping of the regional watershed as it existed before modern development, an invaluable historical and cultural record." The historic preservation officials focused on the agreement document and the judge's seal. This seal belongs to Territorial Judge Ambrose Whitman. He was known for his unusual respect for indigenous land claims during a period when such rights were routinely violated, one observed. His involvement gives this agreement particular credibility. For the next 2 hours, the experts meticulously documented the chamber's contents, taking photographs and creating detailed inventory lists without disturbing the fragile artifacts. They used specialized equipment to verify the authenticity of the documents and ceremonial objects. "There's no question of the cultural and historical significance," Michael declared as they concluded their initial survey. "This site represents a unique and irreplaceable cultural treasure of the prairie." "Lake people," Dr. Blackhawk nodded in agreement. "Based on what we've documented today, I'll be recommending immediate federal protection under the Native American Heritage Protection Act. My preliminary assessment is that this site contains cultural patrimony that would qualify for permanent protected status." As the experts continued their work, Elena arrived with a leather portfolio clutched tightly under her arm. "I found something critical," she reported quietly to Jackson. "Remember how I mentioned researching your great-grandfather's background? Look at this." She opened the portfolio to reveal a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1893. The headline read, "Architectural Student Exposes Land Fraud Ring," with a subheadline, "William Calloway Testifies Against Western Territories Investment Trust." Western Territories Investment Trust was the predecessor company to Midland Holdings, which eventually became part of Midland Agriculture, Eleanor explained. "Your great-grandfather was the key witness in a federal case against land speculators who were falsifying mineral rights claims throughout the territory." "I don't think you understand what we've discovered," Elena said, stepping forward with the newspaper clipping. "This isn't just about cultural artifacts, it's about the legitimacy of your company's mineral rights claims themselves." She handed the article to Montgomery, who scanned it with professional interest. "This suggests a direct connection between current mineral rights claims and a documented land fraud case from the 1890s, the federal attorney observed. "That raises significant questions about chain of title that would need to be resolved before any extraction could be authorized." Michael Running Bear nodded. "The agreement we've discovered explicitly states that the Prairie Lake people never consented to separation of surface and subsurface rights, a principle now recognized in federal Indian law. If the original separation of mineral rights was fraudulent, all subsequent transfers would be legally void." Hargrove's carefully maintained professional facade cracked visibly. "These are historical technicalities that have no bearing on modern property law. Western Territories Investment Trust was a legally separate entity from Midland Agriculture. Corporate succession and liability for fraudulent acquisition are well-established legal principles," Montgomery replied coolly. "If the original mineral right separation was secured through documented fraud, Midland's claim could be entirely invalidated, regardless of how many times those rights changed hands." As the legal confrontation unfolded on his farmyard, Jackson felt a strange sense of connection to his great-grandfather. William Calloway had carefully constructed this barn not just as an agricultural building, but as a purpose-built vault to protect cultural treasures and evidence of an honorable agreement between peoples. Now, a century later, that same evidence was protecting the land from those who would exploit it without regard for its deeper significance. The surveying team began packing their equipment, clearly recognizing that the day's work would not proceed as planned. The county deputies, unwilling to challenge federal authority, returned to their vehicles after confirming the authenticity of the federal order. Hargrove remained, her expression a mixture of frustration and calculation. "This is a temporary setback," she said to Jackson, her voice low and intense. "Midland has resources and patience. When the initial excitement fades, the economic argument will prevail as it always does." "I don't think so," Jackson replied calmly. "My great-grandfather stood against your company's predecessors when they tried to steal land through fraud. He preserved the truth, knowing it would be needed someday. This isn't just about economics, it's about honoring agreements that were meant to last through generations." As Hargrove departed, Elena and Michael joined Jackson, watching the Midland convoy leave the property. "The federal protection is just the beginning," Michael explained. "With the evidence we've discovered, we can pursue permanent designation of this site under multiple preservation statutes. More importantly, we can challenge the very foundation of Midland's mineral rights claims." "What happens to the ceremonial items?" Jackson asked. "That will be determined through consultation between federal officials and tribal leaders," Michael replied. "But the agreement your great-grandfather signed gives your family a special role as guardians of this site, a responsibility that would continue under any federal designation." As the afternoon progressed, additional tribal elders arrived along with preservation specialists from the Smithsonian Institution who had been urgently dispatched to assess the artifacts. The hidden chamber that had kept its secrets for generations was now the center of intense but respectful activity, with each item being carefully documented while remaining in place. That evening, as the sun set over the wheat fields, Jackson stood beside the stone barn that had been part of his family's legacy for 4 generations. What he had always seen as simply a well-built farm building had revealed itself as something far more significant, a physical manifestation of his great-grandfather's integrity and vision. The barn that had been built to honor an agreement between peoples would continue to stand, not just as an agricultural structure, but as a protected cultural site that bridged worlds and generations. The land that had sustained the Calloway family would remain farmland rather than becoming an industrial extraction zone, just as both William Calloway and Chief Running Elk had intended when they formalized their agreement beside the hand-carved cornerstone more than a century ago. As darkness fell, Jackson noticed Michael Running Bear standing alone by the barn entrance, his hand resting on the cornerstone where William Calloway had carved his initials beside symbols of the Prairie Lake people. "Your great-grandfather understood, something that was rare in his time and remains rare in ours," Michael said as Jackson joined him. He saw that true ownership of land isn't about exploitation, it's about stewardship. He honored that principle even when it wasn't convenient or profitable. Jackson nodded, feeling the weight of the legacy he had inherited, one far richer and more complex than he had ever realized. The farm that had almost been transformed by drilling equipment would instead become a place where two cultures shared. History would be preserved and honored, the past reaching forward through time to shape the future in unexpected ways. A golden summer morning found the Calloway Farm transformed. Where the threat of drilling equipment had once loomed, now stood informational signs directing visitors to the newly established Prairie Lake Calloway Heritage Site. The distinctive stone barn, rather than being surrounded by industrial machinery, had found new purpose as both working farm building and cultural center. Jackson watched from the farmhouse porch as a small group followed Samuel White Eagle, a Prairie Lake elder who had become the site's first cultural interpreter. The elderly man moved with deliberate dignity as he guided visitors toward the barn, his voice carrying across the yard as he explained the significance of the building's octagonal design. "Third tour group this week," Elena remarked, joining. Jackson on the porch with coffee mugs for both of them. The article in National Geographic certainly brought attention. Jackson nodded. The discovery had indeed captured national interest once the full story became public. What his great-grandfather had preserved wasn't merely cultural artifacts, but evidence of how cooperation and mutual respect between settlers and indigenous peoples had created an island of justice in an era characterized by broken promises and exploitation. "Michael called yesterday," Jackson told Elena. "The federal lawsuit against Midland is proceeding. Their attorneys tried to get the case dismissed, but the judge ruled that the evidence of fraudulent mineral rights acquisition is substantial enough to warrant a full trial." "William Calloway understood the long game," Eleanor observed. "He preserved evidence knowing it might not be needed for generations, but when it was, it would change everything." The transformation of the Calloway Farm had unfolded with remarkable speed once the federal protection order was issued. The Department of Justice investigation had quickly uncovered evidence that the mineral rights claimed by Midland originated in a fraudulent scheme documented in the 1893 case where William Calloway had testified. Most significantly, the Prairie Lake Calloway site had received permanent designation under the Native American Heritage Protection Act, providing both protection from development and access to preservation grants. The Department of Interior had also allocated special funding for the proper preservation of the cultural artifacts, recognizing their unique historical value. The barn itself had undergone careful renovation, preserving its historical structure, while creating proper environmental controls for the ceremonial chamber. The hidden room remained exactly as William Calloway had designed it, now protected with museum-quality conservation methods so visitors could view the artifacts without endangering their preservation. As Jackson and Elena watched the tour group enter the barn, Michael Running Bear pulled up in his car, waving a folder as he approached. "Fresh from the federal courthouse," he announced, handing Jackson the folder. "Judge Keller has issued a permanent injunction against any mineral extraction on or adjacent to the heritage site, effective immediately." Jackson opened it to find the official ruling, a detailed legal opinion spanning 26 pages that systematically dismantled Midland's claims while affirming both the Prairie Lake people's cultural rights and the validity of the original agreement with William Calloway. The judge cited the 1893 fraud case extensively, Michael continued, his satisfaction evident. She specifically noted the extraordinary foresight of William Calloway in preserving evidence of the original agreement and how it created an unbroken chain of legal protection spanning more than a century. What had begun as a desperate fight to save his family farm had evolved into something far more significant. The Calloway Farm was now not just preserved, but revitalized with new purpose that honored both its agricultural heritage and its newly discovered cultural significance. "Have you heard anything from Hargrove lately?" Elena asked as they reviewed the ruling. Jackson shook his head. "Not directly. I heard she's been reassigned to Midland's corporate office. Apparently, rural acquisitions are now considered too legally complex for their regional teams to handle independently." The aftermath of the Calloway Farm discovery had indeed been costly for Victoria Hargrove. The federal investigation had revealed improper coordination with county officials, resulting in ethics violations that had damaged her professional reputation. More significantly, the publicity surrounding the attempted exploitation of land, with documented cultural significance, had severely tarnished Midland's corporate image. Midland's regional extraction project had been quietly scaled back, with leased properties being returned to agricultural use. Several farmers who had been facing similar pressure tactics had used the Calloway case as precedent to challenge their own mineral rights disputes, creating a ripple effect throughout the region. As they walked toward the barn to join the tour group, Jackson considered how differently events might have unfolded if he hadn't discovered his great-grandfather's journal and the hidden chamber. The farm would likely be disrupted by drilling equipment now, the sacred site desecrated, and the cultural artifacts perhaps damaged or destroyed forever. Inside the barn, they found Samuel White Eagle showing visitors the carefully preserved agreement between Chief Running Elk and William Calloway, displayed in a special conservation case alongside photographs of both men. "This document represents something rare in our history," the elder was explaining. "A moment when two men of different worlds chose to honor a deeper truth than what their society recognized. While governments and corporations tried to separate the people from the land, these men found a way to preserve both connection and truth for future generations." Jackson listened with quiet pride as the elder detailed how his great-grandfather had designed the barn specifically to protect not just physical artifacts, but a sacred relationship with the land that defied the exploitative practices of the era. The tour continued to the carefully preserved ceremonial chamber, where conservators from both the Smithsonian and the Prairie Lake Cultural Heritage Center had worked together to stabilize and protect the artifacts. The floor mosaic mapping the watershed had been particularly delicate, requiring specialized techniques to preserve while making it visible to visitors. This represents one of the most significant intact ceremonial spaces of the Prairie Lake people ever discovered, Samuel told the tour group. William Calloway's decision to build the barn precisely over this sacred site and his family's unwitting stewardship of it for generations has given us an unprecedented window into traditions that might otherwise have been lost forever. As the tour concluded, a familiar figure appeared at the barn entrance, Dr. Diana Blackhawk from the Department of Interior, accompanied by an elderly Prairie Lake woman wearing traditional ceremonial attire. "Mr. Calloway," Dr. Blackhawk called, "there's someone who's traveled a considerable distance to meet you. This is Margaret Running Elk, great-granddaughter of Chief Running Elk and keeper of the tribal oral histories. She came from Montana when she learned about the discovery." The elderly woman, well into her 90s, approached Jackson with evident emotion. "Young man, I grew up hearing stories about this sacred place, My grandfather told me how his father had entrusted its protection to a white settler who promised to keep it safe until our people could reclaim their heritage. Margaret gestured to the ceremonial chamber. For generations, we kept the memory of this place alive through our stories, but many thought it was just a legend, a tale of cooperation too unlikely to be true. Now, thanks to your family's guardianship, we can show the world that even in the darkest times, there were moments of respect and honor between our peoples. Her validation reinforced what Jackson had come to understand over the past 3 months, that his great-grandfather had made a conscious choice to stand against the exploitative practices of his era, believing that someday the truth of what had happened would be acknowledged and honored. That evening, after the visitors had departed, Jackson sat alone in the now quiet barn. The building that had been part of his daily life since childhood had taken on new meaning, not just as agricultural infrastructure, but as a deliberately designed sanctuary protecting cultural heritage across generations. He thought about the entry in his great-grandfather's journal. All is secure. The sacred items rest where they belong, hidden from those who would misunderstand their significance. I have honored my promise to the elders, and in return, they have blessed this land with prosperity that will sustain my descendants, if they remember to honor the earth that feeds them. William Calloway hadn't lived to see the discovery of his carefully preserved chamber, but his foresight had not only protected important cultural treasures, but had ultimately saved the family farm itself from industrial exploitation. The promise he had accepted had, a century later, become not just culturally significant, but the key to preserving his family's agricultural legacy. 6 months after the discovery, the Calloway Farm hosted an official dedication ceremony for the heritage center completed adjacent to the historic barn. Government officials, tribal leaders, and community members gathered to commemorate both the cultural discovery and the preservation of the working farm. Dr. Blackhawk represented the Department of Interior, officially designating the site as a National Cultural Heritage Landmark, a status that recognized its unique significance while allowing it to remain under shared stewardship between the Calloway family and the Prairie Lake people rather than direct government control. What makes this site truly extraordinary, Dr. Blackhawk told the assembled crowd, is not just the artifacts preserved here, but the story of cooperation and respect they represent. 4 generations of the Calloway family maintained this barn, without knowing what it contained, yet their care ensured these irreplaceable cultural treasures survived intact until they could be properly recognized and shared. As part of the ceremony, Jackson and Margaret Running Elk together unveiled a new plaque beside the barn entrance. It bore an inscription in both English and the Prairie Lake language. Built by William H. Calloway in 1897, to honor an agreement, with Chief Running Elk rediscovered by his great-grandson, Jackson Calloway, in 2023. May this site continue to teach us that true stewardship of the land requires both wisdom from the past and vision for the future. The farm that had nearly been transformed by resource extraction had found new purpose, that honored both its agricultural traditions and its unexpected cultural significance. The stone barn that had silently guarded its secrets for a century would continue standing, not as an obstacle to progress, but as a bridge between cultures and generations. As the ceremony concluded and guests mingled on the farmyard that had hosted 4 generations of Calloways, Jackson found himself standing beside the barn's cornerstone, where his great-grandfather had carved his initials alongside symbols of the Prairie Lake people. He placed his hand on the weathered stone, feeling a profound connection across time. "You built better than anyone knew, great-grandpa," he murmured. "Your promise kept ours." The Calloway Farm would continue, not just as a working agricultural operation or cultural site, but as living testimony to the power of keeping promises and the unexpected ways the past can reach forward to protect the future. The century-old mystery had finally found its resolution, and in doing so had ensured that both the cultural heritage it protected and the land that sheltered it would endure for generations to come. Camera pans out as visitors explore the farm. Children from both cultures play in the fields, and members of the Prairie Lake Nation perform a traditional blessing ceremony. Inspirational music swells as narrator concludes. The story of the Calloway Farm reminds us that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what we can see on the surface, but the principles and promises preserved by those who came before us. A farmer's stone barn, built to honor an agreement between peoples, ultimately revealed its purpose at the perfect moment to preserve both cultural heritage and agricultural tradition. Perhaps the greatest discovery isn't what was hidden, but how a single act of integrity can echo through generations, waiting for the moment when its truth is most needed. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like and subscribe for more hidden histories and remarkable discoveries of cooperation across cultures. Remember, history isn't just in museums and textbooks. Sometimes it's waiting to be discovered in the most ordinary places, patiently biding its time until the world is ready for its lessons. 1 year to the day after the discovery of the hidden chamber, Jackson Calloway stood on a small wooden platform erected beside the stone barn, addressing a diverse crowd that would have been unimaginable 12 months earlier. Tribal elders, agricultural students, historians and farmers from across the country had gathered for the first annual Prairie Lake Calloway Heritage Festival, a celebration of sustainable farming practices and indigenous knowledge that had grown out of the unexpected partnership between cultures. My great-grandfather wrote that this land would prosper if we remembered to honor the earth that feeds us, Jackson told the audience. It took generations to fully understand what he meant, but I believe he would be proud to see how his vision has been expanded and shared. The transformation of the Calloway Farm over the past year had exceeded everyone's expectations. What began as a desperate struggle to retain agricultural land had evolved into a nationally recognized center for cultural preservation and sustainable farming that had fundamentally changed how people understood the relationship between land stewardship and cultural heritage. The Heritage Center, funded through a combination of federal grants, tribal investments, and private donations, now house not only the preserved artifacts, but also an educational facility where traditional agricultural knowledge from both settler and indigenous perspectives was taught and practiced. Most importantly, it had been designed to enhance rather than replace the working farm, ensuring that Calloway land remained in active production while sharing its deeper story. Samuel White Eagle, now the center's permanent cultural director, joined Jackson at the podium. In just 1 year, more than 10,000 visitors have walked these grounds and learned how two men from different worlds found common purpose in honoring the land, he explained. More importantly, over 200 farmers have participated in our workshops, combining traditional indigenous knowledge with sustainable modern techniques. In the front row sat Margaret Running Elk, who had extended what was supposed to be a brief visit into a permanent relocation to help guide the center's development. At 94, she had become a beloved figure at the farm, sharing stories and traditional knowledge that had been preserved in her family's oral histories for generations. Most remarkably, the discovery had sparked a regional reconciliation movement, with representatives from several farming communities and tribal nations working together to identify other sites of cultural significance and develop cooperative management approaches that honored both agricultural and indigenous heritage. As Jackson surveyed the audience, he noted one unexpected attendee seated near the back, Victoria Hargrove, The former Midland executive had maintained a low profile since the collapse of the extraction project, her company having publicly distanced itself from her aggressive acquisition tactics following the federal investigation. After the ceremony concluded and guests began exploring the educational exhibits, Hargrove approached Jackson. Her characteristic corporate polish had softened noticeably, replaced by a more thoughtful demeanor. "Quite a transformation," she observed, gesturing toward the Heritage Center and the carefully preserved barn. "Not what I had envisioned for this property, but impressive nonetheless." "Not what either of us expected a year ago," Jackson acknowledged, studying the woman who had nearly succeeded in transforming his family's legacy into an industrial site. Hargrove nodded, surprising Jackson with a moment of candor. "I miscalculated, not just the legal situation, but the community response. It's changed my entire perspective on rural development." "How so?" Jackson asked, genuinely curious. "I've started a consulting firm, helping farmers protect their legal rights when negotiating with corporations," Hargrove explained. "Turns out there's more value in preserving agricultural heritage than I recognized. The skills I developed finding legal weaknesses now help families protect themselves." There was no direct apology in her words, but Jackson detected something like respect, perhaps even a reluctant acknowledgement that the values he had defended had proven to have substance and worth beyond sentiment. As Hargrove departed, Elena joined Jackson, watching the former executive's retreating figure with raised eyebrows. "That was unexpected, almost seemed like growth." "Professional evolution," Jackson replied with a slight smile. "She's discovered that protecting land rights has market value when corporations are involved." They walked together toward the barn, where the ceremonial chamber had been carefully preserved, exactly as William Calloway had designed it. Now with enhanced conservation measures that protected the artifacts while making them accessible to visitors and tribal members who came to connect with their heritage. "Your father would have been proud," Elena said quietly, "not just of saving the farm, but of how you've expanded its purpose." Jackson nodded, thinking of his father who had maintained the farm through difficult years without ever knowing the secret history hidden within its walls. Each generation of Calloways had preserved something they didn't fully understand, their stewardship ultimately protecting both cultural heritage and family legacy. Later that afternoon, as the festival continued, Jackson slipped away to a quiet corner of the property, a small family cemetery where generations of Calloways rested beneath ancient oak trees. He stood before his great-grandfather's weathered gravestone, William Henry Calloway, 1865-1938, farmer, builder, man of his word. "You built this barn to honor your promise," Jackson said softly to the worn stone. "A century later, that promise protected your farm. I don't know if that was part of your plan, but I think you'd appreciate how it turned out. The unexpected discovery had not only preserved the Calloway Farm, but had transformed Jackson's understanding of his family history." The quiet farmer, whose gravestone revealed nothing of his remarkable actions, had made a conscious choice to stand against the exploitative practices of his era, a principled stand that resonated across generations. As Jackson returned to the festival, he passed the newly established teaching fields, where students from both the agricultural college and the tribal school were learning integrated farming practices that combined modern techniques with traditional knowledge passed down through generations of Prairie Lake people. The Prairie Lake Calloway Agricultural Heritage Trust, established with grant funding and tribal partnerships, had created an endowment ensuring that both the cultural center and working farm would continue to operate together in perpetuity. Michael, Running Bear approached, watching the students with evident satisfaction. "This is what makes the Calloway site unique," he observed. "Most cultural preservation focuses solely on artifacts or buildings. Here, we're preserving knowledge, practices, and a relationship with the land that spans cultures. My great-grandfather believed some agreements were worth honoring, regardless of what the law recognized," Jackson replied. "I don't think he was just talking about documents." That evening, after the visitors had departed, Jackson met with Eleanor, Michael and Samuel in the farmhouse kitchen, the same room where they had strategized during the desperate days of the previous year. Now, instead of mineral rights notifications and court orders, the table held plans for expanding the Heritage Center's educational programs and crop schedules, integrating traditional prairie plants with modern organic techniques. "Hard to believe. It's been a year," Michael remarked, reviewing visitor statistics from the center's first season. "The attendance numbers have exceeded every projection, and the waiting list for the agricultural workshops keeps growing." Elena nodded, sorting through media coverage of the Heritage Festival. "The national attention is what surprises me most. 3 documentary filmmakers, journalists from across the country. Your great-grandfather would be astonished." "Or maybe not," Jackson suggested. He understood the power of doing the right thing even when it wasn't convenient. He just couldn't predict exactly when that example would matter most. As they discussed future plans, Jackson's niece Abby arrived, an agricultural science student who had transferred to the state university specifically to participate in the new indigenous agriculture program being developed in partnership with the Heritage Center. Her decision to reconnect with her family's farming tradition represented yet another unexpected outcome of the discovery. "Uncle Jackson, you need to see this," she said excitedly, placing an old metal box on the table. "I found it while organizing Great-Grandpa's tools in the workshop." The box contained photographs they had never seen before. William Calloway, with Chief Running Elk and tribal elders, the construction of the stone barn with indigenous workers helping place specific stones, and most remarkably, a hand-drawn map showing the relationship between the barn's position and significant geological features that aligned with the watershed patterns depicted in the chamber's floor mosaic. "He documented everything," Abby marveled. "He just made sure these records wouldn't be found unless someone was specifically looking for them." The discovery of yet another layer of their family history reinforced what Jackson had come to understand over the past year: that preservation wasn't passive but active, requiring deliberate choices and sometimes considerable sacrifice to protect what truly matters for future generations. 2 days later, as the excitement of the festival subsided, Jackson received an unexpected visitor. An elderly farmer introduced himself as Frank Peterson, explaining that his grandfather had purchased land from William Calloway in 1912. "When I saw the news about your discovery, I knew I had to come," he explained, showing Jackson a small wooden box. "My grandfather left this with instructions that it should be opened only if Calloway's agreement ever comes to light." Inside was a letter from William Calloway explaining that Peterson's land contained a natural spring considered sacred by the Prairie Lake people, with instructions for its protection and a small carved stone marker to be placed near it. "My family has kept that spring undisturbed for generations without really understanding why," Frank explained. "We just knew it was part of our agreement when we bought the land." This new piece of the historical puzzle suggested that William Calloway had created a network of protected sites throughout the region, each preserved through personal agreements with landowners he trusted, a grassroots conservation system that had quietly functioned for over a century. As word spread of this new development, other families came forward with similar stories: small protected areas, specific farming practices, or landmarks they had maintained through generations based on agreements with either William Calloway or Chief Running Elk. A pattern emerged of a much larger preservation effort than anyone had realized, implemented not through government action, but through personal integrity and kept promises. The stone barn that had been built to honor an agreement between cultures had become a catalyst, revealing a hidden history of cooperation that had been functioning quietly across the landscape. For generations, its full extent only now becoming visible. 1 year after the discovery that had saved his family farm, Jackson Calloway stood beside the stone barn in the gathering dusk, watching as lights came on in the Heritage Center, where an evening program on traditional star knowledge was about to begin. The weathered structure that had sheltered both livestock and cultural treasures for over a century had found its true purpose, not as an obstacle to progress, but as a bridge between past and future, between cultures and between different ways of knowing the land. The century-old mystery had been resolved, but its ripples continued to spread, touching lives and reshaping understanding in ways that would continue long into the future. The farm that had almost been lost had instead been transformed, not just preserved, but revitalized with renewed purpose that honored both its agricultural roots and its unexpected cultural significance. As Jackson turned toward the farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of Calloways, he felt a profound sense of continuity and purpose. His great-grandfather had built a barn to honor an agreement between peoples. A century later, that agreement had saved the barn, and in doing so had ensured that both the family legacy and cultural heritage would endure for generations yet to come. The weathered stone barn had finally revealed its secret, and in doing so had secured its own future while illuminating a path forward, a century-old promise whose fulfillment had created a legacy greater than anyone could have imagined. Final drone shot pulls back to show the illuminated Heritage Center and stone barn, amid golden wheat fields stretching to the horizon as the sun sets, farms and tribal lands now visibly connected rather than divided across the landscape. Sometimes the most powerful inheritance isn't what appears on any deed or document, but the commitments we honor across generations. When we recognize that stewardship of the land transcends ownership, we discover connections that were there all along, waiting to be remembered. If this story has inspired you, subscribe for more remarkable discoveries that show us how the past continues to guide our present through the power of promises kept. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.